Hi everyone. Today I want to look at understanding your English language learning students. There are a lot of them, and as time goes on, we're going to have more and more English language learners in our classrooms. And we need to know how we can give them an equal education to those whose native language is English. The law states that just because they are English language learners does not mean that we should be able to treat them differently and not give them an equal education. So we need to figure out how to provide that best for our classrooms, especially if we're not all learning their native language, which would be impossible. Some of you would have to learn Spanish and Turkish and Russian and any other language, all right? It is impossible for us to learn all of their native ones, so we need to be able to help teach them to learn English. So, to start off, let's look at a history of language teaching methods. First one to look at is the grammar translation method. People would give them a reading passage and have them write out the exact translation of what that passage said. Now, that allowed them to be able to write, to understand that this word might mean this and this word might mean that, but it might be harder for that student to write a coherent sentence. All right, maybe they're directly saying, oh, well, this is the sentence, all right, but if you look at German versus English, the verbs are in a different order in German than they are when I write it in English. So maybe they're not learning that context. The other thing is they're not practicing saying it. So because they're not necessarily speaking it, they're not forming these messages on their own. They are seeing it on paper and just speaking it. So this was not a good method to focus on in the classroom, and they needed some other ideas. So then they went to the audiolingual method. Audiolingual is supposed to work on habit formation. There's a lot of repetition, saying words over and over. Dialogue drills. If I say, hi, how are you? And the student says, I am good, and they turn to the next person and say, hi, how are you? This is a dialogue drill. It's getting them talking. However, maybe through this, they might only be learning what the correct response is. They might not necessarily understand in their head, oh, well, yes, I can say I am good, but do they necessarily understand what good means? All right. So these students would have to get used to responding. They may not be able to have a full-on conversation after that, though. So audiolingual is not going to help them to have conversations other than what they've been practicing. So then the last method that I want to focus on with you guys that we should be using in our classrooms is called direct method or natural approach. The idea is that we're not really supposed to use the learner's first language, which most of you have a hard time doing anyways, all right? But we want them to have a full immersion experience. If I think about the people I went to college with, I know that most of the students who studied a language became the most fluent when they went to that country that speaks that language. They were fully immersed in the language, and they didn't have a choice but to try to communicate in that language. Sure, they're not going to be speaking English from the get-go. As soon as they hear you guys saying it, they're not going to go off and speak it, but they're going to be forced to use that part of their brain more to develop how they're going to say these words and communicate with you. It is very similar to how we acquired our first language, all right? If you, when you were a baby, you came out and you only heard that language going on, that's the language you're going to be focused on learning, all right? So because they're being put into this new situation where they have to learn this other language, that part of the brain is going to be functioning to pick up on that language to be able to communicate with you. Use a lot of vocabulary. When we use this, we want to make sure we are helping our students learn words. We don't necessarily want to focus on grammar. We don't want to focus on how to make things plural, where in the sentence it goes. First, focus on the vocabulary. Help them to understand what is a computer. Not necessarily that you want to make sure that computer comes after, or it comes in the subject if you're telling them about it. Alright, we're not worried about the grammar. We're worried about what the words mean and what they are. So give them a lot of vocabulary in your classrooms. We also want to emphasize listening, reading, and communication. Now, once again, this is a lot very focused on those who are just learning the language, who are just starting to acquire it. I'm not going to expect my students to start writing, because writing is a whole other process. But in order for them to have conversations with me, in order for them to learn these words, they should make sure that we are telling them, speaking it, so that they can listen and hear it in their brains. Okay? We want them to read it so they can see it on paper and try to take in how these words are spelled. As I read through it, a student can see, oh, reading, R-E-A-D. She said reading. They can start to pronounce it out and see how letters are pronounced, which will help them. And we want them to get to the point where they feel comfortable speaking it. So by immersing them in all of this, they should get to that point. Like I said, writing and grammar instruction should come later on, once they've got the vocabulary and the ideas behind how they say things down. Now to look at theorists, alright, we've got Noam Chomsky. He was around in the 1960s, and he thinks that language development, language develops from student knowledge, understanding of language from cognitive abilities, alright? You have to have a basis, is what he's saying. And so, when it comes to our students, we want to make sure that they've had this vocabulary so they can build on this vocabulary, build on their cognitive abilities. The student knows that, let's say lapis, alright, a pencil in Spanish. If they know lapis, you can compare that to pencil in English and help them put two and two together. He also believed that everyone is born with an LAD, a language acquisition device. That there is a part of your brain that is there just to sort out languages. Alright, and as we go and we learn more about students who can learn more about languages or can learn other languages, we see that that kind of makes sense. That happens, and through brain studies they found out there are different parts of your brains that are wired to deal with different parts of the language. After Noam Chomsky, we've got Vygotsky. Vygotsky is the one who taught us that social constructivism helps us to learn. And this goes throughout education. We all know that it's not just a language learning thing. However, if I'm trying to speak and learn a language, I need to have those interactions. So I can hear the words, I can hear the pronunciation, I can hear the context, I can put all of that together. And without being in and around that, I'm not going to understand what people are saying. And Krashen, the last guy I want to talk to you about, in 1983, he's the one who came up with the natural approach, which we just looked at on that last slide. Now there are very many similarities, and there are some differences when you learn your first and your second language. Like you said, I didn't choose to speak English. I had to speak English in order to get my point across to my parents. So some of the similarities is, when we start, I need to start somewhere. And they usually start with short utterances. Alright? Might be just one word, might be just sounds. Those short utterances, though, are going to get across. Mom, mom. Alright? Short utterances. I know the word. It's going to start off that way. I use context clues to figure it out. I hear Mom talking. She's on the phone. I know she's talking about a family member. Alright, I hear her say something about uncle. So, whether she's talking to my uncle, or her uncle, or if she's talking to something, I know that uncle is a family term, because I've had to call my uncle uncle. So I can use context clues to figure out who people are talking about, what the situation is, to put words into these categories that we have. And last one, overgeneralize the use of words. Maybe because I know that my mom's brother is my uncle, I might call my aunt my uncle. Alright? I just know that they're together, so I'm going to say uncle, uncle, uncle. And somewhere along the line, somebody has to teach me, no, if it's a female, it is your aunt. If it's a boy, it is an uncle. So that is just an example of overgeneralizing the use of words. And like I said, somebody's got to teach you somewhere along the line when to use that and when not to use that. The difference between your first language and your second language is mostly necessity versus motivation. As I've said, no choice in coming out learning English. I really think French would have been a great language to learn. It's beautiful, but I didn't have a choice in that matter. I had to learn it in order to communicate. However, when it comes to your second language acquisition, a lot of the time, learning a second language, you have to have that extra motivation to do it. It's not just going to come naturally. If you were born and both of your parents speak, or if your parents speak two different languages at home, then, that's more of out of just you've learned it, alright? But if I go to a new country, I need to have the motivation to learn it. I need to be willing to do that. I've had students where they didn't have any motivation and they didn't show any progress in their English. I would give them a basic picture of a bird and I would say, what is this? I would have that conversation with them before we even took the quiz. I'd be like, we'd go over it every day. This is a bird. And then they would have their Spanish phrase. They would tell me what it is in Spanish. And then I would have them practice saying bird. And then on Thursdays when it came to taking the quiz, they did not even want to try the English language. They wanted to tell me this is what it is in Spanish, and that's all they put on their paper. And therefore, they didn't do so hot. They didn't learn because they didn't want to learn. They wanted to be able to speak their own language, which is great. But in the classroom, they need to be able to start learning English. So, once you get that motivation, you have to go through your different steps to actually go ahead and acquire these languages. And it's important to know the steps because you need to know what your students are going through. You can't just assume that this kid is not learning the language because he doesn't want to, or he's not practicing because he doesn't want to. He might be in this first one, which is the pre-production period or the silent period. They don't understand what you're saying, and they are taking it in, which is why it's important for us to speak. Alright, it's important for us to talk to them using vocabulary and using comprehensible input, which we will talk about later on. Alright, using words that they can understand or start to understand to get our points across. This usually lasts about 6 or more weeks and as I said, it's just the student taking in everything around them, trying to build the language in their head before they start speaking it or practicing it. Once they start practicing it, you've got your early production stage, and it's usually just going to be short words or sentences. Same deal, like we said, as your first language. Your first utterances: mom, milk, can I have this, can I have that? Alright, just short words and sentences that get their point across. The third stage is speech emergent. They start to build longer phrases. They use context clues and familiar topics. If they're talking about family, they might use what they've learned to refer to their sister or their brother. Alright? They recognize that family and sister and brother can go together, and they're starting to put these topics together. Fourth is beginning fluency. This is where they're socially almost fluent. They can have full-on conversations with the other classmates or with you, but they still struggle to express themselves, maybe even just correctly, due to their lack of vocabulary. They may not understand how to say something in a polite manner because they're still learning how to speak it in general. So we have to have patience and work with them to learn how to say things the right way. Intermediate fluency, socially and academically fluent. So not only are they able to have a